a senior online designer here at Ferris, and I've been working in education and having to teach controversial subjects and topics in many different formats to many different population groups over the years. So I thought it would be a great subject to share given the recent events. If anyone wants to popcorn out who they are and motivation for choosing to come today.
I'm Mari Kermit Canfield. I'm Coordinator of Research Services and Creative Learning Librarian at Flight. And obviously we teach reliable research and finding reliable information at the library. I also annually teach the controversial topics speech research in the communication department, and a similar project usually for English 150 and 250.
So this is probably right up your alley then.
Yeah, we're concerned about it even more than usual.
I can only imagine. And hopefully you'll also have some resources maybe to share back for other people as we try and address this for all of us here. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'll go. I'm Jerry Sherlink. I'm a faculty advisor in the statewide criminal justice program in Metro Detroit area. So I generally teach 3 different classes. One is police role in the community. The other one is ethics in criminal justice. And the other one's report writing. Report writing doesn't tend to be too controversial, but the other 2 do deal with quite a few controversial topics. So I saw this offering, thought I'd take a look.
Good. Thanks, Jerry.
I think you're muted.
Ah.
Is it your microphone again?
Yeah, it's my microphone again.
Oh no, it's working now.
Okay, is it working now? So my
Yes.
name is Stacey Anderson. Yeah, I have been having microphone problems, as Mari knows. I'm a librarian as well. I actually work with criminal justice, so that is one of the reasons why I was interested. I also work with social work. And looking for human trafficking topics have been really challenging for our students lately, because of QAnon. So, so anyway, yeah. So I agree. CJ has controversial topics, and also, and I'll be really honest with you, I get challenged by students in CJ, particularly in the law enforcement academy, when I tried to introduce the idea of fact checkers. So was told they were all biased. So, so it was interesting. So, but it's a concern I have in general for both of those programs, because they're both dealing with touchy subjects, and both professions are under a lot of scrutiny too. So.
Yes. Yeah, that scrutiny adds a whole different level.
I think you're waiting for me, Tracy. Dan Campbell,
Yeah.
also of the e-learning department, and mostly doing tech support today, but might chime in if something relevant comes along. Good to have you all here.
Yeah, it's interesting. Actually, when I thought of doing this presentation, Dan and I were brainstorming just topics in general. When we look at the big picture of teaching online and the shift to remote, and what are some things to equip people with, and as well as just things that we each feel strongly about. This happens to be one that I feel strongly about, and it never really honed in on the idea of even like criminal justice, but I can, as being a target field, but I can tell you that it probably has its origins in some of that. Not only when I first started teaching, where some of these ideas started playing out. I taught inner city in High Point. At the time, even I was married to a police officer, so we saw a lot of this on a daily basis. So some of these strategies come out of that world where it was a combat school. And then, you know, when Stacy said she gets challenged, I laughed because I have 2 college students that, you know, come and go depending on whether dorms are open, closed, all that good stuff. And one wants to be a lawyer and one is in the CJ program. So I get challenged a lot, even just waking up in the morning on different things. So it's great to have everyone, and absolutely chime in at any point. I will share the link to this presentation, and then I'll also share a link just to some additional notes that I have afterwards. So let me go ahead and share my screen. And okay. I'm used to having my extra monitor, so I have to move all my little bars around here and find the correct tab. There we go. Okay. Okay, so already went through that. These are the basic outline, and I think this is in my history of having to present these types of topics. Following these outlines and going through these different steps have served me well, I think, in avoiding going from controversy to conflict, because that's one of the biggest things, that controversy does not always mean that it's going to become a conflict. But when we are teaching controversial subjects, often it's either because we observed a conflict going on and want to share about it, or because it's something that we do not want to escalate into a conflict. So specifically, what are some 2020 and 2021 topics that are controversial right now? And is this, different from other years? How so? These were some of the things that I was thinking would be good to flesh out just a little bit. What are some things specifically that are controversial right now?
Well, as I brought up, and it's not so much controversial for my students, but human trafficking is ironically, it's a controversial topic in that for me, in that it's hard it's hard for the students to discrete, to separate out it's muddied the water, I guess. So it's less controversial. It's just super confused, but I would say I do a lot with CJ students in the master's program, and they do a lot with body cameras. So that would be a controversial topic that I know they study. I know we did one about military equipment and, the purchase of I just lost the word, but excess military equipment and the militarization of police. So those are two things that I know I've worked with for sure.
We're doing a lot with gun control, election reliability. Yeah, let's see what else has come up. Foreign relations to China, coronavirus response, vaccine distribution. Just goes on and on and on. But a lot of the discussion is whether something is a problem and then how it's being managed. So two separate issues, like whether it exists and then whose fault it is. And sort of lack of ability to have a unbiased discussion, academic discussion.
And you bring out some really good points that we're going to kind of flesh out a little bit about even where you decide the controversy is. So, Jerry, any particular controversies that come to mind?
Just about every topic in criminal justice can be controversial. What is the police role in the community? Use of force, hiring, promotions. What's ethical, what's unethical? What's the right way to enforce the law? What does justice mean? Rehabilitation versus punishment, crime control policy. Just about everything can generate, arguments on several different sides of all the different spectrums. I haven't had any real conflicts arise out of those topics, but I think it's how you manage the folks, but lots of differing points of view. And a lot of that depends on, as you probably know, somebody's life history and their own experiences. But every topic, that I talk about in ethics or police role in the community or crime control policy can generate lots of very differing opinions and passionate opinions.
Yeah, it looks like Andrea joined us. Andrea, we were just discussing what topics in each of our areas just overall are controversial and how is this different from other years. So everyone has just shared a couple. I didn't know if you felt comfortable introducing yourself and sharing some controversial topics that you run into, or if you want to wait and lurk a bit, it's up to you.
I can go ahead and share. I just walked in the door, so I was trying to get my coat and hat and everything off. But controversial. So I'm Andrea Kitomari. I'm in the School of Education, and I run a great grant program for at-risk students to help them stay in education and graduate from theirs. And for me, controversial topics have been and continue to be anything around LGBTQI plus, and then anything that's around racism, equity. Like it's just really challenging because I think sometimes the students aren't thinking about the intersectionality of different topics. They just want to look at something through one lens. So those have been two very, very controversial topics, and especially in the wake with George Floyd and everything that, is going on. I feel like, in trying to prepare teachers, we should be preparing them to address these types of topics in classrooms with their students. So.
Well, you just preached to the choir, because that's pretty much why I started even talking about this topic. And I've always talked about it when I work with my pre-service and in-service teachers in the past. So thank you for that. Yeah. Is this year really any different? And if so, in what ways than any other year when we really look at the number of controversial topics that affect what we're teaching right now?
It feels different to me because even I do a genealogy assignment with Mari, and even that feels different this year because I was always aware of the challenges that some students had, particularly some of our African American students, and then this year our Hispanic students too with that assignment. And it's a very, it doesn't sound controversial, but it's at least a challenging assignment for a lot of people that brings up potential generational trauma and things. And it feels different this year. If nothing else, I feel more aware this year, more so than ever before. I feel like everything is just much more out, and it feels a little more raw. And that's me speaking probably from a place of privilege. I haven't had to deal with things on a day-to-day basis. And now I feel like I need to, and I need to figure out how to, I don't know what I need to figure out how to do, but I need to figure out how to do something.
I'm trying to figure out how to get this bar out of the way, but I like the word raw that you used. I think that is something that I have noticed, and I think a lot of people have expressed in different areas. Other thoughts on whether or not this year is really different than any other year?
It's absolutely a different year. Like, everything has become extreme, and everybody's reached a breaking point while being huddled up at home. And certainly we are very privileged that we are huddled up at home.
Yeah. Yeah, the idea of privilege takes on a new meaning. Like, I'm privileged for living in Cadillac because I can go outside and have so much more space. I could not imagine if I was at a small apartment or a city right now. That's not really anything, that I question. Yeah. Yeah, one of the biggest differences is because everyone is, sheltering in place or whatever variation of the wording on that, in addition to the controversies that the pandemic and the restrictions from the pandemic itself create, the sheltering in place takes away that diffusion or that ability to even go talk to other people right away. So even if something happens in your class, when you're having a discussion in the past, people kind of filter out, you watch them, they form small groups, you can hear the chatter, you can get a feeling of, is there tension, not tension, positive, negative? And they have, even that comfort or security of getting together with other people, or not. They're definitely going back to the racism things and other things that are really coming out. There are a lot of people who did not have that privilege, and that's also coming out. But now everybody, in a weird way, the playing field's a little bit more even on where they are in their own space, cut off from people. But at the same time, media comes in where the playing field is all over the board and it's in your face no matter where you go. If you want to connect with the outside world person, however you want to phrase that, you're connecting to media, and the media is all over the board. So that's something I think that makes learning how to handle this in an online environment even more critical, because it is, for many people, you hear the stories. I got off Facebook because everybody was, too controversial. I can't talk to my friends. You hear these stories over and over, but at the same time, you hear the stories of isolation. So managing these are also critical.
There was an
If I
article
could
this-
just
Oh,
add,
go ahead.
I think this year is a little bit different too because of the election, and all the rhetoric that was going on with the election. I was teaching a criminal justice section of FSUS, and so we were looking at policing, just as a broad topic and kind of relating it to the history of policing and where we are today. And so then that kind of became a little controversial, and I tried to keep the controversy down. I was like, I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm not trying to, be on one side or the other, but just bring up, this is the history of policing and this is what's going on in policing today. And then they start talking about the election and how that's been involved. So I'm kind of glad we got out of that class before the insurrection thing happened, but but because of the what's going on in society, I think some topics that may not have been controversial get kind of a twinge to them in the political climate that we're in today.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And I like how you said that, you start talking about one thing and it leads to something else. And these things are all, very prevalent. And for many of them before this year, they have not been so out in the news. That part is very different. So, Stacy, you were also going to share something?
There was an article in the Atlantic just published yesterday about what we've lost is our weak links or weak relationships. And they said it's kind of interesting how important it is. And that could just be the person, like they said, the barista who knew your order, or the people that you saw every day, as you came into the building and stuff. And they said I think some of that is where we lost our, when you hear people talk about how, like, when you don't watch the local news and when you used to be, all there was the local news and the local paper, everybody kind of had to, I don't want to say, but meet in the middle more. And it's like, sometimes I think some of those weak relationships and those weak connections that we have with people are kind of what gave us stability, but also gave us some commonality with people who we may not have anything else in common with. And so now what we've done, we've all kind of retreated to our niches and our groups, like you said. And so now, because we're not allowed to go out and just have casual conversation with people, that we've kind of lost even some of our ability to just.
Well, it made you see the common person as human and generally treat people in a polite, humane way, instead of like, I can just beat everybody up, be nasty, and be, rude and possibly violent.
So, but even talking, so I can imagine classes online trying to talk about controversial topics when people don't know each other very well, that either will inhibit them from saying anything, or they'll feel like they can say whatever they want. And I can see both things playing out. But I always talk about this one. We had a fairly terse boss, but when and you could disagree with them, but in the end you knew that you had a lot of things in common with them too, so that you couldn't be like, you could be frustrated in a situation, but you weren't angry at that person because you knew so much more about them and you had other connections to them. And I feel like we've lost a lot of that. And I can see how classmates, when you don't create that continuity or that bond between classmates, even if it's just a weak one, I can see how, like Mari said, everybody becomes an other.
Yeah, even seeing, in Zoom, whether people are like you or not like you, when we can, either have virtual backgrounds, or even if we have a real background, you only see a little bit of anybody. You don't see the whole thing. Whereas, in person, there's a lot of that that's lost. And I think you're right with the social skills, just that general practice from the time you get up and navigate your world, you are essentially practicing how to speak to other people that are not necessarily like you. And if you do speak, like if you're at a grocery store line and someone cuts, there is that peer effect, for example. People stare, people turn, you get peer feedback, you get niceness. All these things are modeled, whereas in the online world, you can ghost people easily. Conflict, I don't like what you say, end the meeting. But even we can be accidentally promoting that, even in Zoom, if we don't build in that, because you just end the meeting and boom, you're gone. Without that walking off together and dispersing slowly. I think a lot of people have, as you guys have spoken, many of these things have already been hit on. And I like in a couple of different ones that, like when Stacy shared about the genealogy thing, that it might not sound like it's a controversy, but in fact, it can be. A lot of times that controversy and conflict can be, perceived as interchangeable, but they're not. We can have differences of opinions, and that's part of, again, our role, I believe, in higher ed is to teach people how to have that. I have my opinion, you have your opinion, I respect you. And we can either come to consensus if we have to, or we can choose not to agree and still respect each other. And I think that's, part of separating that controversy and conflict. So that's where we'll go through some different examples. And I just shared, like from my own field of ed psych, nature and nurture is one that's just, again, that's an ongoing, it's always been around, probably always will be around. Maybe something will change, but behind the controversy is always looking for that conflict. A lot of times when something becomes controversial, it's because there is something that maybe has not been resolved. So like the role of intelligence testing is something that plays very much into nature and nurture. And as soon as you add that into the nature and nurture, it becomes much more likely to escalate into conflict. Even, like if we want to talk about racism in the schools, the role of intelligence testing, it completely, the way it's structured right now, it's premised towards, middle and upper class white students, not people of color, the way down to the wording of the test. So they tend to get more money. But again, unless you add that dimension, nature and nurture, that can be relatively non-conflict. Part of where this comes into, and that's, I put this framework in there, and again, I'll share the link for the presentation so all of you can have this with a couple of links, because it's competing values framework. Oh, I left out the word values. That's one of the frameworks. There's variations on it. The original framework has been around since the 80s, was created by Cameron. But what I like about it is because it gives us a tool, and we'll talk more about tools, to understand that the world is not a controversy or conflict-free place. And some of these conflicts or, controversies, they're always going to take place. There's always a balance. The bottom line is, I'll use, school as a background. You've got a school budget. Well, you can't pay everything for everybody, so you have to balance it. And then you've got those different perspectives, because you've got the teacher in the classroom. Well, they want things for their classroom, but then you've got, the money counter, and they need to balance things, in their area. So some of these are always going to be most likely controversies, and they may have many conflicts because they're not, there's no way to solve it. It's a wicked problem. But some controversies, it might be that our goal, we can resolve these. What constitutes a need for special education? That still changes over time, but there are standpoints, moments in time where there's kind of a generally agreed upon definition of certain things. So just in your own practice, always making sure, even when you're talking about the controversy, is it something that is going to be is it going to resolve something, or is it something where it's looking at how to balance the different perspectives? This is a website, and again, on the slideshow, it'll link out to the whole website. And I just always like this because it's really easy to avoid teaching controversial topics. I mean, I think, race in particular in this year has been one of the ones where, there's been a lot of calling people out on the fact that it's not discussed. I know in the recent Tech Trends, one of the research articles, it went through every single research, like 7,000 and something research articles about online teaching. And less than 5% of them dealt with anything related to highly controversial topics, including racism. I think racism was mentioned in like 3% of all ed tech articles, which then in curriculum theory, we call that a hidden curriculum. You know, if you don't talk about it, it doesn't exist, but actually it does. That just maintains status quo. So I think, you know, this year has really brought out that there is a major problem here. And I just always like this, you know, why teach controversial topics? Because as nice as it would be to avoid them, the other thing, even just from a selfish teaching aspect, the motivation begins with a problem. We want to solve problems. We have problems. And so whether you know, start talking about these things because you believe it's the right thing to do, or because you want to use motivation strategies, these are some things that we can do. And I think, again, with the right tools, then we, as those in higher ed, I mean, I feel, going back to it, we are the people with the intellectual freedom. We are teaching those gen ed outcomes, how to critically think, how to interpret knowledge. We are preparing people before they go have a job. So when I look and I hear people complaining about the way the world is, and I think, well, yeah, there's a lot wrong with the world. What are each one of us doing? So what am I doing in my own space to make sure that I am teaching the people around me to be able to understand, you know, the humanity of each of us, you know, what it means when we make one decision versus another. And so that website's definitely one to explore later, because it has even like some structures in your classroom for how to set up problem-based learning. I know like our police academy and our criminal justice program does a lot of that. One of the ways that, you know, I did this, again, we already covered this, but one of the examples that I shared in this presentation, this is actually the 2016 election. I was at GVSU, I was visiting faculty at the time, and, you know, similar thing, because it was still a Trump election. So you have a class that was highly polarized and coming in, and then they were doing, the class that I taught was their mandatory ed tech class. So at the time they were spending 35 hours in their, not their student teaching semester, but the semester before. So they were getting supervised by their supervising teacher, being in the classroom, helping with small groups. And, you know, they would pour into the class and they would bring all these things from them, you know, from their experience, and want to talk about them. And yet, you know, hybrid class, you only have a certain amount of things to talk about. So specifically, I created this activity because twofold. One, to model some of the ed tech concepts, but the other is that democracy and our elections and the politics, that's one of the great topics that no matter what discipline you're in, there are things in this that when we look at our world and what may be right or wrong with, you know, events that have been transpiring with democracy and our elections and everything else, each one of us in our own discipline has an area that most likely we could improve how we're teaching that. So I created this lesson plan. So they actually were creating lesson plans, and I'll share it. But one of the important things when you're looking at, for example, you know, any particular controversy or a controversial topic, one of the biggest things is identifying exactly where it intersects with your content. So in this case of this example, what I was looking at, what my students were pouring in with, was they were telling me data and they were telling me statistics and they were reading me things, and kind of related to what you're talking about with primary sources and library research and things. And I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, but not saying, are you on drugs? You know, when they're sharing the different things. And again, my role was to teach them some tools that would help them better understand that, not to create their opinion or to share mine, but to give them the tools. And so the actual process of pre-planning to teach a controversial topic, of course, there are times, and we'll talk about it at the end, where we don't have time to pre-plan, but kind of going through these different steps is, you know, that first step, identifying connections to your content, because there are a million controversies and we cannot, you know, if you try to be everything to everybody, you're going to be nothing in a lot of ways. So you have to choose your niche and what's one topic or controversy that you really personally feel strongly about that matches your content. You know, Jerry shared ethics, you know, so he's got a whole bunch of different ones, but so because of that, he has freedom to choose specific ones that maybe he's looking around and he either sees a weak area or he can see out in the community or in current events. You know, looking at the desired outcomes, what do you want your students to get from talking about it? Because if we just talk about something and we don't expect something of an outcome, then, you know, that's great, but that's not higher ed teaching. We also want to take some time and we'll talk about some specific tools. You know, what are the tools that you want to pre-plan and provide your students with ahead of time so that, again, you're growing their skill and preventing conflict, you know, some rules to put in place and how to do that. And then also looking, you know, in the classroom, because these are academic discussions, what you would be looking at for assessment. So, and again, you know, what are some core topics of the controversy? And the question is, specifically out of the controversy that you might want to teach, where would it connect to your discipline? And again, we have a limited time to teach. So I don't know, like I said, I shared the one, because for mine, data visualization and technology, that's one of the weakest areas. If you look at K-12 teaching, they are so weak in that area. It's also weak in all the student standardized scores, and it's weak across the board in the amount of time spent on interpreting information. So that was why I selected that rather than, you know, politics or the democratic system. That's not directly in my field, but data visualization tools, that is. So I chose that as my leverage for forming a conversation. What are some different specific content area overlaps with any of the different controversies going on that make a good leverage in your disciplines?
Can you ask that again? I was too busy reading your.
Yeah, can you repeat the question?
Like I said, I'm sharing all this.
understand the question.
And these are those are links from 2016, so some of them might not be current, but again, I'll share all this, and I have updated resources, and Dan has some as well on some of these things. My question is, so looking at these big, you know, or small potential controversies, what are specific areas in your content area that intersect with what's going on in the bigger world? Because that's really, you know, in looking at narrowing it down and making sure that your students understand that you are going to have, you know, it's going to be a controversial discussion and a controversial topic, but it moves your content forward and it's something they need to know. And that takes us defining that a lot of times for them. You know, we need to bite off which piece of the puzzle fits our content.
I'm afraid ours is a little meta because it's disinformation and misinformation, and it needs to be infused into whatever. So we don't develop the curriculum, right? And we don't develop the assignments, but those concepts have to be somewhat infused into what instruction we do. So it's meta in that regard. And then you also, everything I've been reading, you also can't tell people they're, you know, you have to, it's critical. We used to call it critical thinking, right? But you have to somehow figure out how to get people to understand that there's disinformation and misinformation, and it's like almost like from what I've been reading, they have to come to that realization somewhat on their own. We can't, the more you challenge it, the more they will dig deeper into their. So it's meta for us. I mean, it's hard. Mari may have something different to say because she does work with the communication classes and she does teach the controversial topics. But for me, it's more of a, I don't, you know, it needs to infuse what I'm doing, and I can't be too, and I feel like I can't be too overt about it because I feel like that's controversial in and of itself.
Right now.
Yeah, there's a difference between teaching how to discern, you know, facts or quality of facts versus my facts versus your facts. That's a big difference, and you're right. That's a good difference to remain aware of when you're teaching.
Right now, we can show them where to find reliable information, and you know that there's a process for identifying reliable information. But the belief that the information is truthful is a personal hurdle, right?
Yeah.
And what how do we bring a student over that hurdle? And I believe it is our job, but it's a extremely draining. And yeah, and then to do it with a whole class and to identify, you know, right now when everybody's so, students were already shut down and we see them one time, we don't get to have a relationship with them. So identifying who is having that difficulty is, you know, is a difficulty of ours. Sometimes we can tell by, you know, what they're looking for or what they're writing about. Yeah.
I think in education, I don't teach any of the education courses, but I think one thing that overall our department has heard from, you know, our accrediting body that we need to do better is infusing diversity and multiculturalism into the curriculum. And so, yeah, I think in my role, I try to, you know, supplement what they're doing in classes, but they're not really getting it in classes as much as they should. So I feel like my job is a little bit more difficult. So helping students to not only understand the topics, but then how do you take that into the classroom? So we're doing a project with literacy right now where we're trying to prepare students to have difficult conversations around books that are focused on diversity and social justice issues. And but you got to have to be comfortable to do that with students, to do a read aloud and then have a discussion. You have to have some background information. You have to have reflected yourself and kind of be self-aware. And so having to bag students all the way up to bring them all the way forward, just to get to the point where, okay, now you're ready to engage with students because you've been self-reflective, you've learned about different cultures and different, you know, types of diversity. Now let's talk about the actual text. And then how do you then have that conversation with a group of students? And so I think the teaching of it is difficult because we haven't done some of the background work that's needed so that people are self-aware before they go in and try to teach, you know, this controversial material.
Yeah, those are some excellent points. And I think that's why that, you know, before you jump in and say, oh, I see this current event and I'm just going to teach about it because it's important, it is that making sure that you know where you are with it and that you have defined for your students so that if the discussion starts to go in a direction that maybe you don't have the background, that you have, you know, defined it well enough and have that mechanism so you can say, you know, you asked a great question, but in this session, we're only going to talk about this. So creating those boundaries, letting them know that, you know, where you're standing, because I think that is one of the challenging things, because you lose credibility if you start going someplace that you're not capable of doing. And the other part is if you aren't prepared with something controversial, then you hit one of those, you know, big accidental potholes that you were completely oblivious to because it wasn't in your expertise, then all of a sudden it can circle back to someone having that. For example, Stacy mentioned running across something with generational trauma or something. And then you're not prepared to deal with it. And then all of a sudden your class is a mess, you know, or you know, basically put more hurt on students or put more conflict and you're not prepared. So it is that defining, like I said, with the Trump election of 2016, I took the, you know, in some ways it may be the easy way out, but I didn't go anything with the election because it was already so dramatic. That's why I used data visualization tools. But knowing that tool is something that everybody needed to form their own opinions. So, Jerry, anything as far as examples of something in particular that you have to bound where it hits exactly to your content? Because obviously police have been, going back to racism hand in hand, you guys have been hammered.
Yeah, and I've got 30 years of practical experience in the field and 40 years total in criminal justice so far. So, I mean, you know, the job itself is controversial. You're generally inserting yourselves in the lives of people who really, at the most of them, really don't want you involved in their lives. So just the role is controversial no matter what area of criminal justice you work in. Your point that you were making just a couple of minutes ago, I think is really important when some of these topics come up, is you need to kind of have a feel for where you're at on some of these topics and be willing to allow that idea that you may not have all the answers or you may not have all the data to answer some of those questions. What I try to do sometimes is I teach the ethics class kind of like you would get in a law class, where most of the classwork is putting people in real life situations where there's ethical dilemmas and trying to get them to work their way through those. And I don't have people raise their hands, I pick them. And you can see how from day one, they're frozen and they don't really want to talk because they're afraid of what they're going to say. And then after 15 weeks of that, I mean, the atmosphere of the class is so much different because they've expanded their understanding of one another's experiences and points of view. And they actually start to understand how to critically think, problem solve, and talk through some of these questions, because almost every situation you find yourself in as a criminal justice practitioner, it's not like yes or no, right or wrong. It's such a gray area in so many cases. And that can generate, you know, a lot of different perspectives and points of view. And again, a lot of that depends on sometimes your own personal experience with the criminal justice system. So, but I think you have to be aware of your own, you know, limits and limitations and weaknesses and your own kind of personal formation in some of these areas, you know. I can generally tell the students whose parents are police officers by the positions they take, and I can pretty much tell folks that have had negative experiences in the system by the positions they take. And how do we get these folks to talk to one another and work their way through those? Because they're going to be working hand in hand with one another out there in the field.
I like that you hit on even that you call on them and you call on them throughout, because that is something that we'll talk about. And that's a really great strategy. And that's, you know, I already shared this part as far as like, you know, my goal for their outcome to come out of the controversial, when we did that 80-minute lesson plan, is I really just wanted them, you know, to have the better understanding of the tools. I wasn't looking to change their mind about the election. I was looking for them to have a better understanding about the tools, because again, I'm not a poli-sci major. It is not, I don't feel it's my place to teach them election. It is my place to teach this. And like you said, Jerry, I liked how you phrased it, where when they're out in practice, they have to make these decisions. And so just teaching them to talk through and be better at making these decisions when they are going to be in a wide variety every day, all day. That's what that career field is. And so I think that's really important that we make sure that we know, like you said, keep those outcomes in mind. You know, those tools, this is where I think one of the biggest things we can do in education is focus on making sure we give them tools ahead of time, or, you know, in the moment, so that they have something to think about. What I find, and this goes back to some of the psychological principles. So if I don't give someone a tool, and I think maybe it was Andrea who talked about reading children's lit. You know, if you give them something, whether it's a framework like the competing values framework there, or if it's a shared experience of a book or a shared video, if you give them a tangible, then all of a sudden we're sharing our perspectives on something. It can be both, because we have something in common that's in the middle, in between us. So I can feel one way about it and someone else can feel a different way about it, but we're not at each other's, directly at each other. So when you're planning, you know, your lesson plan, making sure that you've got ahead of time, again, you can give it out depending on the complexity of what you're talking about. You might want them to think about the framework, because maybe it is, even the framework itself could actually be an issue of controversy. But sometimes it's just enough to give them something It could be a piece of art. It could be a policy that you want them to discuss. It could be an example from the news. It could be a piece of art, a sculpture. But if you give, before the discussion, outside of the words, give some type of tangible object or experience, that's one of the best ways to create structure, so that, again, you've kind of neutralized that either or and created the both and. So that's one of the best tools, again, to have. Some other tools that you want to always make sure that you have in place are, kind of like a tool in the routines. Jerry mentioned calling on people, that's his normal routine. So you want to make sure that whatever you've got routines and rituals that students have already managed to learn. So for example, if you are going to be talking about a really controversial topic, do you already have in place the way and the mechanisms? How do they communicate? Do you give them notes? Do they always recommend people, like, for example, don't use the chat, and we'll talk about the technology, but making sure, what is their communication tool for what you're looking for? Do they have a mechanism that they can use to communicate? Because you want to have those things established ahead of time, so it's not in the middle of the discussion where they have to think about, oh, I'm thinking about what so-and-so is saying, and I don't know how, am I supposed to interrupt them? Am I supposed to raise my hand? Am I supposed to write in chat? Am I supposed to send notes? Those types of things. But always having those tools, and again, especially some type of tangible, any kind of framework, like I said, framework, policy, piece of art that exemplifies what you're looking at, because that impersonalizes it, or depersonalize it, I guess would be the way. It just kind of makes it a little bit more in the third person. And then I say rules, and those are the rules that you want to be very clear about. Again, this is where keeping it a productive academic discussion about a controversial topic versus, a knockdown, drag out, or an argument. It's like anything else, you want to have these things in place. And this is where a lot of people have netiquette, for example. You always want to make sure that you practice netiquette. But some of the rules for dealing with controversy, one of the best rules that I have seen that really helps people, it slows the quick talkers down, but it also grounds it in the research or what you're talking about it. And so having students practice where you can only speak if, when you're speaking, it can't be your opinion. It has to be something from one of the texts that we've read, or from, and again, you control the sources that you consider to be acceptable. And when you add that kind of a rule where it's what they say needs to be connected, and if they're inexperienced, like the 100, 200 levels, making sure, give them some articles, or give them, a closed set of resources ahead of time, some parameters, but making sure, so when they're saying it, it's not just me saying this, because again, that sets people up for, well, he said this and I don't like what he said, and she said that, oh gosh, she's thought, But if you have setting up that controversial discussion, it's not just having netiquette, but it's actually having those conventions for, they have to reference whatever it is in their speech. Another rule that's really helpful, especially in online, but it's very helpful in face-to-face. I love it in Toastmasters. We have a timer, and we have different colors even to give people if they're going to be speaking longer, but just having a time limit, set in place ahead of time. So the rule is, when we have this discussion, because say we have, 25 people, you can only talk. I've seen people where they put, first of all, a time limit on the length. So it can be, 30 seconds to 1 minute. So no one's dominating. But then you can also, there are other ways to put in the rules where you may only speak 3 times during this discussion. Or once you speak, at least 4 or 5 other people, set that wherever you feel is comfortable for your class, because well, hopefully you get to know your class, but that way, again, if it's none of those rules, well, say Jerry says something and I don't like what he says, so I respond back, and then maybe, Andrea supports me, and then I still go back, and so all of a sudden it's me as a student with other students just kind of arguing with them. But if you set the rule that someone says something and they have to wait, that allows for other people. So all of a sudden it opens it back up where it is a discussion. Another, rule with that, if it's something super controversial, I also recommend I turn the chat off. The last thing you want, and it's not that students won't, some students will still text each other behind and they figure out their little social circles behind, but you don't need to encourage that in your setting. So I usually have so the chat is off unless it's the chat where you can have the settings so they can only chat to everybody. So if they, for example, if they have low bandwidth and they need to use the chat, they can put it in the chat. Another strategy or rule that I like to put in, because especially for controversy, there are people who are very quick thinkers and they can assimilate information quickly that they hear and come back with an argument. Other people, it takes a while to process and they need to hear it and reflect on it. And especially when you're online, having providing the students with like a Google Doc or a OneNote where the sharing settings are set so everybody can be in it. So we could be typing responses. You put your outline ahead of time so they can be typing in that document also. So for example, say we're on slide 10 or whatever we're on, but all of a sudden now I have something I remembered, I finally put together my thought for slide 5, I can still add it and it's still present, but it's present in a shared document. So again, that gives those non-quick verbal people a mechanism so their voice also can be heard. So again, that's another, rule or convention to put in there. So the timing, number of people speaking, and then providing for people who tend to have a slower reaction. You can do the Google Doc during there, and it's also helpful to have that in that Canvas discussion for later, because sometimes even within the hour, it's just not enough. And you can still set those same, netiquette type expectations. So again, it's not opinions, has to follow whatever criteria or citation that you want, but having that so that people can process and think and be included. Those are some of the recommended rules. And I call them rules because in my experience, this may sound dumb, but it sounds like all of you have worked with a similar population. It just tends to go over just more concretely if I say these are the rules for the discussion, that it just kind of creates that safe parameter, just like when you're in a room, you know where the door, you know where the window is. There's some just nice concrete tangibles so that the rest of it can be those gray areas that we need to flesh out. So it's kind of one of those semantic things, but I have found that it works quite well. So any other rules or kind of conventions or rituals that people have found that are successful?
Well, I think some of your rules are important anyway. That you're never allowed to have a statement that is I like or I don't like, or that it must be supported by some content, not necessarily from your reading, but it can't be a subjective statement. I don't remember which professor who said it was, but it was recently that like a collection of anecdotes does not equal a fact. It was a really great quote by a Ferris professor quite recently.
That is a great quote. Yeah, Dan gave me the warning we're coming up on 4. And I had a feeling when I switched rooms, I don't have my cell phone or my clock or anything. And I knew when I did the outline for this, I was like, oh, this could be a whole fun class. So I'll go through real quick the last few slides. And then, like I said, I can put the link to the slide presentation in the chat so you'll have it. And then also we'll share the recording out so that you can have this. And I think there's a lot more. Hopefully we can continue some of these discussions at Ferris. I chose that image and I talked about assessment for learning. I think another big thing when you're teaching or talking any kind of controversial topic is making sure that you are assessing how they grasp the process and how they participated, not making sure that you are not assessing their opinion, or right or wrong. Because again, you don't want to set them up for, oh, what do I have to do to get an A? I have to agree with him. Okay, I agree with my professor, whatever he says, because then I'll get an A. You want to set it up so that it's about the process, making sure that they understand that the participation points, or, however you're scoring it, shows that whether or not they could critically, identify the core issues in the controversy. Could they relate it to the text? Could they relate it specifically to concepts in your class? Making sure that you're assessing focuses on those types of things so that they still retain the ability to hold on to their perspective. There are times, of course, we definitely hope their perspectives may change. That's our goal, or that we wouldn't be in education. But, as Stacy said, that can take time, and letting them have that time to process, but focus on the process and the appropriate participation, because that's what we want. We want them to go forward and be good citizens where they can talk about these things. I think all of you have mentioned a lot of these, and I just want to go over, but these are, the common reactions to controversy, avoidance, overt aggression, passive aggressive, delay, rushing, mediation, and assuming controversy is a conflict. And that's why those different rules and the conventions, especially like overt aggression and passive aggression, those are ones that when you're setting up for having the talk, that having that citation requirement, that helps negate some of that. And then sharing specific exemplars of what constitutes appropriate conversation about something and what doesn't, sharing those examples ahead of time so that they know, what is okay, how do you talk about something. And I put, delay and rushing and mediation, those three are the ones where making sure that you've got those, the rules or the conventions so that people don't talk too much, don't dominate, and also having those outlets for them to be able to think through and maybe giving something in writing. And this is the biggest one, just making sure that you always share with your students. One of the best things we can do is not assume the controversy is a conflict, because if you assume it's going to be a conflict, then likely it probably will. Yeah. And then these, just got a few more slides, and I think, a lot of you may be familiar with these. There's a lot of examples of, especially, the first one and the third one, where, the I'm just asking for a friend, the role playing. Again, looking, if something's controversial, distancing it from ourselves, distancing it from them by, creating, whether it's a case study and giving them the criteria of something that, has the different elements you want them to look at, or creating the role play so that they are playing a different character other than themselves. Go ahead and assign them to, analyze this situation as if you were, the bystander, the parent, the child, the teacher, the newspaper reporter, the chief of police who had to report it, all those the dispatcher. You can go through and assign roles, because again, that's going to give them that practice of looking at controversy, but it takes them away, out from their opinion, kind of out from their safety net. So they have to start thinking, and gets them into that critical thinking. That pro-con consensus one is one of my favorites for online, because you can set that up either synchronously or asynchronously. And that's one, if you have something that you want them to analyze, it's kind of a 3-part step. So in that case, it works, you have to pair them up. So first of all, you're assigned, you're either taking the pro side or the con side, but you do it with a partner. So you go through, so say Mari and I go through and we pick out all the pros from this one approach. And meanwhile, other people, maybe Stacy and Andrea, are having to put together, they're putting it together all the cons. And they go through the same, we all go through the same article, but they go through and identify the cons. We go through and we completely identify the pros. And then in the next step, so you have them do something in writing, whether it's a discussion response or maybe they speak that, whatever, and you set time limits appropriate for the article. But then the next step is they, basically they're paired up with someone who had the opposite side. So then you argue with that person and basically decide who won. You present your pros, they present their cons. So you're switching up the different pairs to do the pro and the con. And then you flip it again. And so if you started out having to argue the pros, then you have to argue the cons. And then you flip it the last time where you put people together and it has to be a consensus building. Because once you've gone through and basically done the pro side with the con person doing the devil's advocate for you, then you've done the con side and flip flop, but then coming to a consensus. And that's one of the nice strategies that, going beyond the discussion board, post twice, post once, reply twice, but doing it in a structured format so that you are set up so that the students are playing the devil's advocate, but then you flip. And after they've, put their heart and soul into arguing why the one way is right, well, then next thing you know, they have to argue why the other side is right. And then they have to figure out the consensus. Because then I think, like Jerry mentioned, the gray areas, a lot of times that's where it is, the gray areas of life, where we honestly, until you really get in deep, you don't know where they are, but helping them do that from all the different sides. And then I'll just share a couple of technical things that you can use when you're in the online synchronous environment. And we have, email us at any time because we have lots of different tutorials. Zoom has great resources on this as well, but just making sure, like Dan's the moderator, he gave me the warning for 4 o'clock, thank goodness, or we'd be here till, anyone got tired and abandoned me. Well, I'm still talking on my high horse because I love it. But having a moderator to make sure that things are going well, and that's something, if you're doing something with a super large group, you can even reach out to our department if it's a special event or something that you just need an extra person maybe to take that role so that you don't have to think about the technology part. Using those breakout rooms in Zoom so they can be in smaller groups. That's another good way to kind of, keep things a little bit more diffused, but also to allow them a better space where more voices can be heard. The shared notes, that's something, again, that's an easy technological tool that you can use, whether you use Google or Microsoft Office. And always remember, make sure you know how to mute, because you can mute participants and take time at any time, regroup, restate, reconvene, redo, replay, but always keeping in mind our goal is, time in, not time out. We don't want it to end where people walk away angry. We want it where they can have that safe place. So sometimes we do need to take a breather, but making sure we come back and have closure. But you have, with Zoom and other tools, you can do that. At worst case, there are situations that I have heard, I've not had this experience, thank goodness. I had it in 4th grade classrooms when you're in person occasionally, where you have to remove someone from that space. In Zoom, you do have that ability. So you can go to your participants menu and you can literally remove them from the room. So if you were to have someone who really just started spouting off vitriol, you can remove them. Always making sure to, again, revisit that so people know why you did it and, setting that criteria up, but you can immediately end it with Zoom. And asynchronous, if you've got something, again, that can be inflammatory, you can, use the controls in your discussion settings where you can have to approve it. You can also look at maybe if it's something that you think could be incredibly inflammatory, maybe you have them do an assignment. So it's not a discussion, maybe it is an assignment first, but then you can still assign peer review options, for example. So they're not sharing their opinion with the whole class necessarily, because that might, could potentially create more problems, but they can have peer review and it'll actually show the rubric right in Canvas with the peer review process. So again, we've got tutorials for all these different things that we would be happy to share. And the grouping tools in Canvas, there's some other just really nice ways to, again, make something a little bit more manageable and kind of shrink it down so that it's not a complete free fall, free for all with so many people that only a few get heard and other people don't. So those are some of the ways when you're teaching and want to address these that you can use within Canvas. And I put the Kenny Rogers just because when I was thinking this, and that goes back to where we started in the beginning. Know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to run, know when to walk away, know when to run. That song just started running through my head when I was thinking about that. Know yourself and make sure that you don't put yourself, plan your exit strategy if needed. If it's something super controversial, have that backup plan, in your back pocket for what you would do, so that way it doesn't even get to that point. because, you know, as long as you keep control and know yourself, where if they're getting into an area that you think you're not prepared to kind of moderate, you know, go ahead and tell the class, okay, we're going to stop right here for now. We'll come back to it later, but make sure you've got that defined in your head so that you're not, you know, in reaction mode. You want to be in that proaction mode and have that type of kind of safe, calming activity that they can move to next. You know, something familiar, like, okay, you know, we've just done this and, you know, people are getting really deep into this, and that's great. So we're going to stop here and we're going to revisit our reflective journals or whatever safe thing that you've got that's, you know, a more traditional activity in your classroom. Again, looking at something soothing, because you don't want to just, you know, be in the middle of heightened emotion and then just pull the plug and check the box off. But making sure you've got that determined in your head and you've got that backup plan. And again, I mean, all of you seem like very experienced teachers, so I'm not concerned, but just making sure that you've got that plan, you know, there. And these things, you know, again, it's all the same things in the teachable moment, and that's where you just knowing yourself, making sure that you've got, you know, if something is going on that just happened in the news, do you want to tackle it that day or not? Making sure you know how comfortable you are with that, and some traditional, you know, teaching strategies that you can use with that, which goes back to frameworks. You know, this now what, so what, then what. That's a framework that's often used to get people to think, okay, this happened. Now what's happening? What does it mean? Then what can we do? You know, KWL is another teaching strategy, and I'll put links to examples of these because I do have links. I just ended up not having time to go back and put the links to the specific teaching example, but it's what do you already know about something? What do you want to know? And things that you learn after you do whatever activity. And it's just a 3-column chart. And there are other variations. But again, when students bring something controversial to your classroom, and maybe it's all of a sudden it happened, bringing them back to some tools, you know, those frameworks, those strategies, so then you can accept, you know, the coolness of something that they care enough about to bring to your classroom to you. It's kind of a trust if you think about it. So they're bringing something to you, they want to talk about it, but having these strategies just kind of in your back pocket. So, okay, this happened, you know, now what happened? What does this mean? What are we going to do about it? The easiest out, if you ever get stuck where people bring something controversial and it's in the moment, because this last year has been full of some things that I know just like seem to blow up on a dime, and then all of a sudden everybody's staring at the TV watching what's happening next. I mean, like the insurrection is a really good example of, you know, 0 to 100 miles per hour lickety split. Is show me the data. You know, when in doubt, take them back to those primary sources and to the data. So, you know, or into your text. Wow, you're right, this is happening. Where in the text has that happened before? You know, pulling those tools out of your back pocket. So those are just, again, some of the strategies of always making sure you've just got 1 or 2 of those. You only need 1. So, and I see the chat thing blinking, and I'm sure that's Dan saying you are way over time. So I am going to stop because I know I am, and I know that you guys have other things that you need to do. We have recorded this, and I will, like I said, I'll add the links to the specific the tools on the like KWL and all that in case you don't happen to have those. And then we'll send out the presentation and the recording. So I'm really glad you guys joined us. I don't know if you have any questions or last minute thoughts.
Thanks for the time. I appreciate the feedback from the other folks. It's very interesting to hear people from different educational backgrounds experiencing a lot of the same challenges. And some of the things you hit on are going to be very useful. So I appreciate your time. Appreciate everybody else's input. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
In our
Maybe I
meeting.
should stop sharing so we can even see it. Yep, there we go. Sorry.